So for someone who has an interest in local history, what am I doing standing in the middle of a bunch of high rises and a major construction zone? Well, this gives you a little bit of a hint. Here we have the remains of a sandstone building. But what's the significance and why is it here? Well, to start, we're gonna go a little bit south of here and go check something else out. So while in many cases a cemetery is the end, today this is where our story begins. Union Cemetery is, I believe, one of the oldest cemeteries in the entire city of Calgary. It was established in 1890, and purely by coincidence, the fellow we're here to visit happened to die in 1890, so likely would have been one of the first burials here. I am specifically looking for Block A, Section 12, Lot 11. And I'm just wandering around here. I do have the cemetery map on my iPad, just not having a lot of success. It's not the most detailed map. You can definitely tell we're in some of the older parts here of the cemetery, not only based on the dates, but by the condition of some of the headstones. And with a little perseverance and a bit of luck, I have found him. This is the grave of Jimmy Smith. Now, there's not much I can do about the spoiler here, but if you're wondering how Jimmy Smith fits into our story, it says there right on his headstone, donated the first funds for the Calgary General Hospital. So Jimmy was a Chinese Christian citizen in early Calgary. He was very unique in the sense of he did everything he could to integrate into Western society. At that time, many Chinese were very happy to stay in Chinatown, really work to maintain their own culture. Jimmy really did not, from what I was able to gather. He was much more interested in integrating and dressing Western, and even adopting a very, Western name in Jimmy Smith. So you'll note from the dates on his grave, he was a fairly young fellow when he died in 1890, and he died due to tuberculosis. And part of his estate was given to the Calgary Hospital Foundation as a gift for the construction of a proper hospital in Calgary. At the time Jimmy died, the only hospital in Calgary was in a 2-story wooden house that they were essentially renting on the banks of the river. It wasn't a true hospital in any sense. So when I originally started researching for this video, I really thought this was going to be a fairly straightforward story of the construction of a hospital, its history, and kind of what happened to it to end up where it is today. But I'm not going to go deep into the history of the hospital itself or the building. Instead, I'm taking a different tact, and I'm focusing on something really different in this story, something I was not expecting to come across when we began. And that right there, I think, gives away what those ruins are, where we started our video. So let's head back there now and talk a little bit more about the history of those ruins. And Jimmy will come up in the story again a little bit later. So now that you know how Jimmy plays into this whole thing, I can show you the cornerstone of what was Calgary's first proper general hospital. Now, it's impressive to remember that at the time this hospital opened, What today is inner city, at that point was actually out in the middle of the bald prairie. And there are archival photos that show you the building standing here all by itself out on the prairie. At the time it opened, the hospital featured 35 beds, an actual operating room, as well as new conveniences such as a telephone and electric lighting. At the same time the hospital opened, they also established a nursing school. And in 1898, Marion Moody became the first graduate of the nursing school that was housed here. Now, I tried to find out what happened to Marion Moody, but I don't know if that was a maiden name or a married name. I'm suspecting a maiden name. I wasn't able to find any record to know where her grave was. I was hoping to visit it at the same time we visited Jimmy, since she's probably buried in Union Cemetery somewhere. But I only spent a few hours doing research for this, and I was unable to uncover anything. So if you know what happened to Marion Moody, the first graduate of the nursing school, please let me know. So it didn't take very long before the hospital felt the need for expansion. And you can see over here, this was the corner of the original building, and there was additional buildings built on this site. According to what I was able to find, in 1899, they added a maternity wing, and by 1903, they added another two-story ward to the site. By 1905, things were booming so much, a second maternity ward was added to the hospital. Now, dates vary a little bit, but it seems that around 1908, Calgary began construction of a new hospital on the other side of the river, which was eventually destined to replace this hospital. The second Calgary General Hospital opened in 1910, and it was shortly around that time that this facility was decommissioned as a hospital. So sources vary, but according to the historical record, somewhere in that 1909-1910 time frame, the Calgary militia took over the building and used it as office space until 1911. At that point, it essentially reverted back into being a medical facility, this time as an isolation hospital for people with chronic diseases such as the tuberculosis that killed our friend Jimmy Smith back in 1890. Now, I did say that I was not going to be in depth on the history of the hospital, and that's the case, because I'm going to jump ahead about 4 decades now. It was really only a short period of time from that 1954 to the late 60s, so say a period of less than 15 years, before the condition of the building began being called into question, let's say, and work had begun on building a replacement Rundle Lodge. By January of 1970, Rundle Lodge had been condemned for the second time in a little over a year. So we're going to pick up our story now in March of 1971. And this is when I fell into a deep rabbit hole that completely changed the tone of this video. Originally, I thought it was going to be a history of the hospital and the building, but it turned into something more, and that was the fight to save Rundle Lodge from the wrecking ball. So in March of 71, a group of citizens known as the Rundle Lodge Preservation Committee basically started petitioning to save the building and have it actually opened as either a medical museum or some sort of seniors drop-in center. At that time, they were estimating that the cost to renovate, restore, bring the building up to code was going to be about $90,000. Their goal was to have that money funded half by the federal government, and then the other half coming from the provincial government and private donations. In June of 1971, the province basically said, no, there is no funding available. A study done by the Preservation Committee listed the hospital as being one of the oldest sandstone buildings remaining in the city of Calgary. It was also determined at that point that the Rundle Lodge was the oldest hospital building remaining in the province of Alberta. By September of 71, the Preservation Committee was forced to admit they were getting nowhere in their fight to raise money to preserve the building. The federal government, in turn, had turned down their funding request for the second time in that same year. So as we move into October of 1971, demolition was scheduled to take place on November 20th. Then the province weighed in and said, you know what, let's do a reassessment of the building and see what the value of it is and what it would actually take to preserve it. And it's around this same time that spiritual grandfather of the DroneOCan YouTube channel, Ken Liddell, chimed in and came up with some ideas for preservation and reuse. So in December of 71, after the initial demolition date had passed, is when we really start to see politicians getting involved. Alberta Public Works Minister Dr. Winston Backus agrees to an order in council with the province saying, let's put together an architecture committee and study the building and see what it actually needs to turn it into space for the Calgary Seniors Citizen Council. Around that same time, Minister Backus meets with Calgary Mayor Rod Sykes, and we're going to hear a lot from him going forward, and comes out of that meeting basically saying the province really shouldn't get involved in what is a municipal government matter. And Rod Sykes, if you're a historic preservationist, really becomes the villain of this story going forward. So Mayor Sykes basically comes out in late 71 and issues a very strong ultimatum that essentially says the city has zero interest in preserving the building, and if the province wants to step in and save it, they dang well need to step up and buy the building and the land and take it over. And on December the 15th, 1971, the senior citizens who lived in this Rundle Lodge moved out to the new Rundle Lodge, which was constructed next door. Essentially, at this point in late 71, the building is left abandoned and empty. So in January of 72, the Alberta Housing Corporation announces they want to begin demolition of some of the covered walkways that connected the original Rundle Lodge building to some of the expansion wings that had been added in the early 1900s. Their logic was they needed to do that in order to build a fire break between this building, which was now sitting abandoned, and the new Rundle Lodge. They were deeming it to be a safety concern. Now I'm going to read this part so I get the names right. But basically at that same time, City Council voted to delay the demolition until that architecture committee had a chance to come back with their findings about the value of the building as it sat. At that time, a fellow named Romeo Benoche spoke on behalf of 25 or 30 concerned citizens of Victoria Park, requesting the immediate demolition of the buildings, stating that the old lodge was an eyesore and a pile of junk. So I'm sure this is starting to sound very familiar to anyone who has ever been involved with any sort of historic preservation effort. You've got half the people who are basically saying, yeah, let's try and save it. And you got the other half of the people saying, what the hell, it's an ugly old building, just tear the thing down and let's get on with it. So the Preservation Committee announces in March they're going to be bringing in comedian Rich Little. They're going to host a $25 a plate dinner, and they are going to use those funds to put towards the rescue efforts for Rundle Lodge. Now, in April of 72, the first reference I could find to using the area as a park and using the sandstone as part of that park was suggested in a letter to the editor in the Calgary Herald. I'm sure there's probably other references to it out there. That's the only one I could find during the course of my few hours of research, but that was the first mention I found of it. So in May of 72, the province announces they're forming a 7-person committee to study the situation and to make a final recommendation on the demolition or preservation of the building and the grounds. In June, the Preservation Committee dinner with Rich Little takes place, and they only managed to sell 200 of the 800 tickets that were available. And instead of raising the $15,000 they had hoped, they managed to raise $824. Also in June of that year, a public hearing takes place at the Palliser Hotel in downtown Calgary to get public input on the fate of the building. Now, it's kind of interesting. At that public hearing, someone tells the story of a man dying in a Calgary hotel in 1894, leaving $100 behind to start funding a new hospital. Now, the question becomes, and this is a bit of an unsolved mystery, is this man and $100 in 1894 a bastardization of the story of Jimmy Smith and his $1,500 in 1890? Or is this a different person who had left money to the hospital foundation? I didn't have time to dive into it in great detail, but it's an interesting little twist in how, if it is the same story, just how different the tale can be depending on when you're telling it. I think the single most telling quote that comes out of those public hearings comes from Frank Gatto. Do we have the right to destroy a building which is of historical significance and thereby deprive the people in 2050 the right to a physical link with their heritage? And I think it's amazing that, we're a lot closer now to that 2050 date than we are to the 1972 date when Frank said those words. But the battle has never changed. Historic preservation always becomes a question of, what do we do today? Do we keep it? Do we knock it down? Do we repurpose it? And again, there's never any easy answers. And even if there were easy answers, the problem is getting people to support it. People love the idea of preserving old buildings and historical sites right up until it's time to open their wallet. And even the committee to preserve Rundle Lodge admitted that when they talk about their fundraising dinner, making $800 out of a potential $15,000. People just don't want to pay to preserve the past. In August of 1972, the province makes one final appeal to the city to ask them for their opinion. Given that nobody from the city spoke at those public hearings at the Palliser Hotel, and Calgary Mayor Rod Sykes had came out in absolute opposition to any sort of preservation, it was pretty easy to tell what the city's answer was going to be. And thus, on my birthday, ironically, November the 18th, 1972, the province comes forth and says they will not preserve the building, and that there is no one who is willing to pay the $400,000 to renovate or preserve the building. This is essentially the real final nail in the coffin of Rundle Lodge. But you have to admire the tenacity of the preservation group. Not willing to give up, in April of 1973, They go to the courts and demand an injunction to stop the impending demolition of Rundle Lodge. Their hope is short-lived, though, as just a month later, the court comes back and has declined the injunction and says demolition can proceed. And so the long journey comes to an end. On August the 21st, 1973, the bulldozers move onto the site and begin removing trees. A day later, on August the 22nd, the wrecking ball swings and Rundle Lodge tumbles, except for the ruins that you see here with us today. By August 30th of 1973, the final trees are removed from the site, and the only thing left is the main arch and the cornerstone. By September, the final site clearing is taking place as the preparations begin for the opening of Rundle Park, what today we know as the Rundle Ruins. And on June the 11th, 1974, Premier Peter Lougheed officially opened Rundle Park. And so that brings us through to today and the modern era here in 2024. The area, which has been a favorite of Calgary photographers for doing wedding photography and high school graduation photos, today sits surrounded by construction, seemingly on all sides. The Stampede Grounds are undergoing a major expansion, and my understanding is that the park is destined to be incorporated into those plans. And frankly, that's a good thing, because as the city swallowed up the Victoria Park neighborhood, Rundle Park has suffered quite a bit. When you visit today, you see alcohol bottles, litter, obvious signs of homeless camps. Normally, I would say that maybe camping with Steve Wallace had been here, but Steve always leaves things in better condition than he found them, and clearly that is not the case here at Rundle Ruins today. So just as Jimmy Smith's gift turned into a modern hospital, turned into a senior's residence, turned into a park, once again, the Rundle Ruins will find themselves reborn in yet another way. And I suspect that they will be around for another 130 some years. So I hope you enjoyed this trip through the history of the Rundle Ruins. It's a site that I think you're either a Calgarian who knows at least part of the story, or you've never heard of it and had no idea that this was here in your own backyard. It's not the most pleasant place to visit right now with all the construction going on. I hope I am able to salvage the audio of this. This is another video that I had to record on my cell phone because I forgot to check to make sure there was a micro SD card in the DJI Pocket 2. So it is what it is. I didn't want to take up the chance or miss the chance to come down here on a beautiful, beautiful spring day and capture the Rundle Ruins as they sit, surrounded by construction, surrounded by litter. They're still beautiful in their own way, but I think the future for them is looking better now than it has in the last few years. So from downtown Calgary, this is DanoCan saying I'll see you in the next video.